Today's guest is Dr. Christine Webb, Assistant Professor of Primatology at New York University. She recently wrote a very important book, The Arrogant Ape, The Myth of Human Exceptionalism and Why It Matters. Now, this is a very important book. It pushes back on a long-standing assumption that other animals are dumber than us. It points out the unique abilities and intelligences of other species, and it was actually noted as New York Times Book of the Year in 2025. Enjoy my conversation with Dr. Christine Webb. The book is absolutely fantastic. It's amazing. It covers so many key ideas and I learned so much from it. So could we just maybe start? Could you tell me why you decided to write it and where these ideas came from?
Sure. Yeah. So the book grew out of a course that I taught at Harvard for a number of years. It was a small seminar discussion-based class. I met weekly with about 10, 15 students. And it was in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, which is centered on this question of what makes us human. And it was my experience that answers to that question would often focus on something like our unique ingenuity or virtuosity and morality, something about our special capabilities. And I wanted to kind of push back against that narrative and say, okay, well, what about the ecological crisis in which we find ourselves? How can we rethink all of these things that we supposedly make us successful in light of the environmental crisis? And it was through those conversations with students about human exceptionalism and the environmental situation in which we find ourselves that really inspired and motivated me to write the book.
Fantastic. So could you talk a little bit about Darwin as your inspiration here? And because you mentioned him several times in the book, and he's obviously a key figure in influencing the way you think about this. And could you also talk about what's wrong with the traditional way of thinking of evolution maybe as a ladder with humans at the top? I think you maybe point to a more interconnected view of humans with other species. It's really thoughtful and it's worth people considering. So could you talk a little bit about that? What's wrong with putting humans at the top of the pedestal?
Yeah, sure. And to just bridge from my last answer, I mean, other animals have always been the ones who have inspired me, and I wanted in part to write this book to reflect on and process a lot of the experiences that I've had living among and working with other animals. So I'm a primatologist by training, and I think that's something that grew out of a lifelong a childhood love of other animals. And then when I was in high school, I read The Origin of Species by Darwin, and it was like one of the first books that I read cover to cover. I mean, Darwin is an incredible writer, and he really gave kind of a scientific authority to these childhood experiences of kinship that I felt and experienced with other animals and nature more generally. And so, at the same time, in my early scientific education, I learned about evolution, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, and words like struggle for existence and survival of the fittest, this notion that individuals are kind of selfishly competing against one another for access to resources. That narrative of evolution definitely dominated in my scientific education. And I think that's true for many. It's true for my students as well, right? They're human evolutionary biology concentrators. They come in with a particular view of evolution and how it works. But that emphasis on competition is only one side of the story. And even Darwin, throughout The Origin of Species, writes about the inherent cooperation and empathy and sympathy and mutualism that occurs in nature. And it's not to say that nature is some, utopian, harmonious place where all beings constantly coexist, but that the undue emphasis on competition has overshadowed this also cooperative and balanced view. And as I argue in the book, competition and cooperation themselves are entangled. One actually begets the other.
So one interesting thing that you point to in the book is theory of mind in other animals. Now, theory of mind has been talked a lot about in the literature over the last few years. So it's the idea that we can kind of predict or maybe read other people's minds. And again, it's been dismissed in other species. But you actually make the argument that animals and other species besides humans do have theory of mind, and maybe in ways we wouldn't expect. So could you talk a little bit about that and your own experiences? Because I think that this is really interesting.
Sure, yeah. And this is a perfect example of another animal teaching me something that I didn't know before, or maybe had assumed the opposite. So I'll share a story and then I'll get into the science a bit more. So when I was doing field work in Namibia with wild chacma baboons, there were a number, we would follow a troop all day, and there were all different ages in the troop. But there was a young male named Bear. He was a juvenile, and he was causing a lot of trouble, pushing boundaries, both within his own social group and also with the human researchers who were following the troop. This is kind of a common thing that juvenile male baboons do. They push the boundaries and test the limits. And this involved Bear sometimes climbing on researchers' legs, trying to grab our backpacks, steal our GPSs. And one day things got a bit more out of hand. So a bunch of baboons ended up surrounding my colleague, and it wasn't really sure what had happened, but it was clear that Bear was involved and had potentially instigated this mobbing event. They surrounded her. They started to slap her legs. They were barking. It was a very scary scene. I was also with her in the field, standing not very far away from her. She, in the end, was okay. The baboons were okay, but it was very scary and unsettling, to the point that we considered maybe not following that troop anymore, because clearly the aggression was escalating. And so the very next day, I was following the same troop, but from a distance. So we decided to keep doing it, but to be especially mindful, give them a lot of space. And I was trying to do that, but all of a sudden, Bear and a number of other baboons start marching directly towards me. And I was in a very vulnerable position. I was kind of wobbling down this steep, rocky incline, and I couldn't easily move out of their way. And so they're coming straight for me. I'm actually terrified. I think, okay, now it's my turn. And my heart was racing, thinking of all the people I wish to say goodbye to. And I tried to remain as calm as possible on the surface, though. And Bear finally approached with these other baboons, but the other baboons kind of kept walking. Bear approached me, and he put his hand in between my hiking boots. And he looked up at me, and he bared his teeth into this most awkward, forced grimace. And I remember it so clearly because I had never seen baboon teeth so up close, and they were so white and square and perfect. And
no processed food.
Yeah, precisely. All those root vegetables.
Paleo diet.
Yeah. And and then he marched on. And as a primatologist, I know that this gesture, this grimace that he gave me, is a pacifying gesture. It's something that baboons do to appease one another and avoid conflicts one another, or reconcile after conflicts. And in that moment, Bear had to know what I knew. He understood something about what I was experiencing, and in my view, also understood that I knew what had happened the day before and was trying to make amends. Now, that capacity to know and understand what another is thinking or feeling is known as theory of mind. And there have been a number of studies since that time that seem to suggest that humans are not unique in the capacity for theory of mind, the capacity to know and understand what others know. And it's another one of these characteristics, these mental characteristics in particular, that this hypothesis that we've erected about what makes humans separate from other primates. And there's dozens or hundreds of them that have been refuted one after the next. And I think, theory of mind is a more recent one, in my experience with Bear certainly supports it.
That's really cool. So you kind of touch a lot on intelligence, and obviously the mismeasurement of all things comes up a lot in your book, and how maybe the way we measure animal intelligence is too human-centric. And I think a really interesting concept that I found absolutely fascinating was this idea of the Umwelt. Yeah. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but like what I imagine is like every animal has their own unique way of creating a world model. So maybe humans depend more on sight, but for instance, a dog might depend more on olfaction. So like smelling things, basically. So I imagine their entire world model is built around smell. And I think I've heard other people make these points before as well. So then I looked up, out of curiosity, like how dog IQ tests or dog intelligence tests function. And they're mostly built around sight. So like we're ignoring the main aspect of a dog's intelligence, because obviously they construct their entire world around smell and scent. And there's a lovely quote in there as well from a poet, and I think again it gives the same message, that a dog creates its entire picture of reality, a mental model of reality from scent.
I think you're referring to Mary Oliver's quote. He writes that something like, a dog can never tell you what she knows, through sight, but watching her that almost nothing. And I think many of us who have had or have the privilege of living with other dogs know that they certainly experience and sense things that we do not, right? And it's it makes you think, right, that if we're not aware of the Umwelt of our closest companion animals like dogs, and we're not designing scientific studies around the unique sensory world and experience, then how wrong are we getting it for beings who are so radically different from us and who we don't, live with and work with in our daily lives, right? What about beings who navigate through echolocation or, primarily through touch or other modalities? And Jacob van Uxkol, who I think I'm probably not pronouncing that entirely correct, but he coined this idea of the Umwelt to refer to the animal's sensory environment and the need to take that seriously when designing studies to test their cognitive or emotional lives and abilities.
And even beyond dogs, some of the examples you gave were incredible. Is it true that an owl can hear a heartbeat, another animal's heartbeat? That's incredible. And dolphins can see almost transparently.
Yeah, because of
that's absolutely
their
insane.
ability to echolocate. They kind of have this X-ray vision, right? So they can tell whether the prey they're hunting, the fish, have a particular kinds of organs or not. And there's been kind of interesting anecdotes about dolphins telling dolphin trainers, alerting them that they're pregnant well before the individual knew, because they are able to sort of see, right? It's quotes around the word see, things that we cannot
create a picture or create a model of reality.
Yeah, and owls. I mean, now every time I see or hear an owl, I'm always thinking, can they hear my heartbeat right now? Because if they can hear the heartbeat of a tiny rodent on the forest floor from, over 20 meters away, then surely they can probably hear mine. And that's such a humbling and really, it's a lovely realization. And then these are just the senses we know and we're familiar with. But there's, other animals who can sense magnetism, right? And platypuses have electrotouch, so they kind of combine touch. They have touch receptors, but also high sensitivity to electric currents. And I mean, there's just it's there's this other book out there by Ed Yong called An Immense World that's all about the Umwelt, and the point is that it's an immense world, and our version of reality is a tiny sliver of it. There's millions of Umwelten, and ours is just one among those.
That's absolutely fascinating. So you can imagine other species are just seeing everything in a completely different way. So you talk a little bit about neuroexceptionalism. So the idea that obviously people say it's in so many popular science books that the human brain is the most incredible thing, the most sophisticated thing in the whole universe. Yeah. But then you give the example, I think, of an ant's brain, which is absolutely tiny, and the computation it can do is absolutely incredible. And I've heard some other people make this point as well, what a fly can do is just absolutely incredible given its size and the size of its brain. And then we spend vast amounts of training data and I guess tech infrastructure to try and build or replicate these abilities in machines, and we can't do it. So that just speaks to how incredible nature is and how much we're underestimating other species. So could you just talk a little bit about why there's such an emphasis on the human neocortex and the human brain, and we don't realize what other species can do as well?
Yeah, and it strikes me as interesting too, because we've often emphasized the size of the human brain and the number of neurons, but actually I think even in computing technology, right, smaller chips, more simple architecture is actually considered more refined and robust. Right. And so if you think about the tiny brains of insects and ants, right, Darwin marveled at the tiny brain of an ant was capable of so much work, and yet was infinitesimal proportion of our brain size. And when I was learning about animal cognition in graduate school, I too, I learned about the human brain, the primate brain, and how the specific blueprint of the primate brain, including this large neocortex and large frontal lobes, were responsible for primates' cognitive abilities. And then around that time, there was also more and more work on bird cognition, so avian cognition, tool use, all sorts of interesting phenomena. And that's raised a big question, like, how is this possible in birds who have, brains that are ridiculed, right? If you say someone has a bird brain, it's like a derogatory comment. And that revealed that, the field of avian cognition revealed that brains that are both smaller and have remarkably different architecture can be capable or can be correlated with similar cognitive feats. So all of these things that we thought only primates could do, all birds were doing as well, right? They were using tools, they were showing forms of rationality, culture, awareness, all of these things. And so that, I think sort of challenged this notion that the human brain or the primate brain is uniquely responsible for complex cognition. And then I think once you sort of start to question that, you can go into brains that are radically different from ours, or with very simple brains, or maybe why stop there, right? Why do we have to think of the brain as necessary for intelligence? That's where did that come from? That's a story. That's an assumption that we've made. And in fact, organisms with very simple brains and who lack brains altogether are also capable of highly complex cognition. And so we need to move away from this human-centric standard or primate-centric standard.
Just on that, so I think you make the point several times that you actually, like, a nervous system isn't maybe necessary for like cognitive tasks or cognition. And I found that a fascinating way to put it, because I never really considered it. And you give some good examples, maybe talking about plants and other organisms as well. So you would just talk a little bit about that, the idea like something can be intelligent or exhibit intelligent behavior without even having a nervous system, which is absolutely
right. So I can speak about my friend and colleague Monica Gagliano's work. She's a plant scientist, and she did a bunch of studies on pea plants, Mimosa pudica, showing that they are capable of learning and remembering. And before people get upset with that language, I'll explain the studies and then we can talk about the language. Basically, these pea plants have a very sensitive threat response. And so when their leaves are perturbed, they kind of recoil them or fold them up in response. And what she wanted to do was look at, okay, can these plants adapt that behavior over time in response to a changing environment and knowledge about whether something is actually a threat? And so she would set up an experiment in which she would disturb the plant in some way, and the plant would have their sort of habitual leaf curling response. But she would do this over time and nothing bad would happen, right? So she would, I think in her first round of experience, she was just like dropping them from a small height, but then nothing further threatening would happen. And over time, the plants habituated to this experience of being dropped, meaning that over successive trials, they stopped folding their leaves in this defensive response. And scientists have studied this in all manner of animals, and it's known as habituation, because you're learning that the drop is not actually a threat. She also repeated this experiment, I think weeks or maybe even months later, and she found that the plants remembered. So habituation is a form of learning. You learn something is not a threat. And weeks or months later, the plants, when dropped, also did not show their habitual leaf folding response. And she tested all sorts of alternative scenarios, like were the plants just fatigued, right? And she was able to rule those out. And the best and most straightforward explanation for these findings is that the plants learned and remembered. And most scientists did not have a lot of trouble with the experiment, the methods, and the data itself. They more had a problem with the words learning and memory. to describe this. And Monica and many other scientists in this sort of plant, they call this plant neurobiology, this kind of growing movement to understand and recognize the intelligent and maybe even sentient capacities of non-neural organisms like plants.
Does that suggest possibly that plants have the capacity to suffer? Some people might think it's a push, but so there's this idea of panpsychism, which you mentioned in the book, I think a couple of times, and it's the idea that like consciousness or a sense of what it's like to be you, maybe, I think it's called qualia. Can that be found in organisms without nervous systems? Because obviously we would have always thought that it would only be seen in organisms with complex nervous systems and brains, but maybe you take a different argument there?
I think as a starting point, I don't really understand what consciousness is. I think no one, if we're honest, really does. And I think at a bare minimum, that requires a lot of epistemic humility, right? I don't even fully understand my own consciousness, let alone yours, let alone a chimpanzee or baboon's, let alone a pea plant's. But I'm not willing to rule it out because of that sort of abstract, nebulous nature of it all. And to the question of whether plants are conscious, I think it's very possible that they are. I think it's under a panpsychist view of the world. I used to say that I was like a closet panpsychist. I'm definitely a panpsychist. I believe by that, I mean that I believe that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous aspect of reality. I think that's actually the strongest and most parsimonious explanation for consciousness, other than these other theories, competing theories for how we explain how qualia, how qualitative states, the experience that we're having right now can arise from physical substrates like the brain. There's an excellent book called Galileo's Error by Philip Goff that I recommend. It makes the philosophical case for panpsychism. And my students always gripe after we talk about the possibility or likelihood of plant consciousness. Okay, well then what am I supposed to eat? Because many of them, some of them might be ethical vegans, and they say, okay, I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. But it's always worth mentioning that animal agriculture kills way more plants than plant agriculture does. So even under a strictly utilitarian perspective about limiting suffering in the world, if we're really focused on limiting plant suffering, then it would still make sense to consume a plant-based diet. That's just what I tell to my students and perhaps listeners who are like, well, what am I supposed to eat?
Do you think we'd ever get to a place where there's such a broad recognition of animal suffering that the majority of people will stop eating animals? And could like an innovation like maybe lab-grown meat help here, or is it just a matter of everyone maybe should switch to a plant-based diet?
There is a lot of recognition. There is a lot of recognition of that animals, particularly in these confined, industrial agricultural settings, suffer immensely, and yet people still might not change their behavior. They have this sort of like rational knowledge that suffering exists in these spaces, but then they're still consuming animal products, and I think that's largely because I don't think the sort of rational abstract knowledge is enough. I think we need experience and exposure to and relationships with these other animals. So I think the knowledge is sort of a necessary but insufficient condition. But I think it needs to go further than that, because I think plenty of people have the knowledge and don't change their practices accordingly.
That's a good point. And I think you actually make the point in your book as well that things like, as you mentioned, factories and industrial level farming, they're actually kept away from visibility. Like they're almost made, it's like out of sight, out of mind, isn't it?
I think that's very deliberate choice on the part of these systems. And it's similar with animal research laboratories, because if the public were exposed to them on a daily basis, like if you drove by, a chicken processing factory, whatever, the empathy would do the work that it does, right? We would have this, I think, a different response and be less inclined to consume animals who are kept in that way if we were exposed to it regularly.
Yeah. Maybe we underestimate like how sophisticated many species, I guess, ability to experience awe or sensations that humans experience. So, for instance, I have a dog, and my dog is absolutely obsessed with cats, and he will literally spend hours just staring up at the tree, like in awe at the cat. And it's definitely a sense of awe because his body is almost frozen, like he's in a transfixed state. So, and I actually saw you wrote a paper maybe suggesting that animals could have religious experiences or definitely experiences of awe or wonder. And I found that really enlightening, actually, because I've never heard anyone else make that case. So could you talk a little bit about your ideas there?
Yeah, sure.
Really cool.
So Jane Goodall was actually one of, I think she's probably the most famous person to have talked about the potential for animals' sort of spiritual sensibilities. And she talks about chimpanzees who do these elaborate displays during thunderstorms and waterfalls. And she said herself that it's possible, right, that they're experiencing a version of wonder or awe in the face of these overpowering natural phenomena. And then my colleague, Barbara Smuts, who wrote the paper, and I was a co-author on the paper, about thinking a bit further about, whether other animals possess awe and spiritual or religious sensibilities. And I think we have a really open mind when it comes to that, right? In the paper, we're not saying yes, they do or no, they don't, but we're exploring this possibility. And the reason why I think that's important, coming back to these cognitive Rubicons that we've long thought separate humans from other animals and other forms of life, right? We had consciousness, theory of mind, self-awareness, right? Morality, culture. You just go down the list, and every hypothesis that has been erected has been disproven in some way, shape, or form. And that, in and of itself, that history leads me to take a moment of pause anytime someone suggests, okay, this is the thing. It's religion, right? How do we know that it's religion? And given the history, shouldn't we be open to the possibility that we're not alone in that capacity? And so, again, I encourage a humble approach to that question. And I love your example of your dog experiencing awe, because awe is about feeling, yeah.
It's genuine awe. It's like his body is completely frozen. It's like it's like he's trying to figure out what it is or what it's doing, because he knows it's not another dog. He's not reacting like that.
Yeah, I've been on hikes with dogs where I feel, and I've also with other primates, where I get the sense that, with certain like landscapes and seeing certain sunsets or really like kind of overwhelming, overpowering landscapes, there's definitely an attention there that suggests to me some version of wonder or awe.
There's definitely something to it. I've observed it so much, there has to be something to it. I actually want to ask you about a point you made in regards to, so traditionally we look at animals as like as groups, or group them all together into one species, but you make the point, and this is obvious, that animals might have different individual personalities or individual differences, and perhaps they react differently to different situations depending on, I guess, their nervous system, their experiences, their genetics even. So could you talk a bit about individual differences in animals within the same species?
Individual variation was long considered to be kind of noise in the data. It's like we were looking for species norms of behavior, and whatever individual variation there was sort of put to the side and considered problematic, when actually there's so much that we can learn about individual differences, particularly when those differences are stable over time and across situations. That's how we define personality in humans. And so to use the word personality for other animals, I think, I even prefer that sometimes to something like individual differences, although maybe people will take issue with the word person in there. But yeah, animal personality, I think, is so important. And anyone who's had the privilege of living with two or more companion animals knows, right, that like dogs are not dogs. And even within the same
they're very different
species or breed, rather, or within the same litter, right, you can have so much variation. And I think I wanted to mention that my dissertation was on individual differences and the propensity to reconcile. So some chimpanzees will just be more likely to resolve conflicts than others. And that might be tied to their overall kind of sociability. Yeah. And
Temperament.
there's individual differences in so many capacities. There's individual differences in empathy. My work has also looked into that. There's individual differences in how exploratory one is, in how creative one is, how innovative. And they have this animal personality has been studied not just in other primates and dogs, but in insects and birds and fishes, right? So it seems to be the rule rather than the exception. And I just also want to make a plug because I think this emphasis, there's the species and then there's individual differences, but I think it's also really important to think about group differences and cultural differences in behavior, which is another level of variation that too often gets overlooked. So a chimpanzee is not a chimpanzee. A chimpanzee from one social group is not the same as a chimpanzee from a different social group. They can have entirely different social and material practices. They have their own cultures depending on where they live and who they interact with.
That's really interesting that you mentioned culture actually there. So I'm reading another book at the moment, and the book is quite good, but it actually made the statement that humans are the only mammals or animals that actually teach their young. And I kind of thought about that, and I was kind of thinking, I'm not sure if that's true. I think a lot of animals teach their young, but I think people like to emphasize the uniqueness of the human brain and human cognitive ability. But I would say a lot of animals teach their young.
It depends on the definition of teaching we're using, but an animal behavior for a long time, the strictest definition was that the individual who teach had to had to experience a cost in acting in a particular way to benefit another individual. It was sort of like a more in line with an altruistic tendency. And even under that strict definition of teaching, right, I don't think teaching comes necessarily at a cost to me. I think I also gain a lot from teaching my students. So I think it's a very stringent criterion. But even under that strict definition, I think meerkats and many other animals, they will catch prey, but not kill them entirely, and then give them to their young so that the young learn how to kill, a scorpion who's who's slightly incapacitated, but not entirely dead. And in the book, I write about Len Howard's work with birds and I believe it was great tits or sparrows, teaching their fledglings about glass, right? And how not to fly into glass, and basically trying to attract them to the glass and then lure them to peck at the glass with a worm on the other side, and then go back out and continue to do this until they learned that there was glass. And so, yeah, again, it's another one of these criteria. It's like, why do we keep erecting this hypothesis? Why do we want to find that one thing that distinguishes us when the history has always moved in the other direction?
Very interesting. You mentioned in your book that you've witnessed after conflict that other primates will engage in same-sex, maybe sexual behavior, and it could be a form of conflict resolution. So is it possible that homosexuality was preserved in the genome for that purpose, or am I overstretching that? Because I don't think anyone knows why homosexuality is preserved in the genome, because obviously it doesn't contribute to
that's a great question. And it is one of the, I think, main hypotheses now for the evolution of same-sex sexual behavior, is that it served to reinforce social bonds and to, in that particular case, manage social tension and repair social bonds in the face of conflict. And it's a great example of what I was talking about earlier, how competition and cooperation are themselves entangled, right? It's through these competitive situations like conflicts that then individuals learn to resolve their differences and cooperate and reconcile with one another. So it's also, I think, a nice lesson in that regard. But certainly it's there's a lot more work about same-sex sexual behavior in other animals, which is ubiquitous. There's thousands of animals who exhibit same-sex sexual behavior, and social bonds, the preservation and establishment of social bonds is also important for fitness, right? It's evolutionarily important for survival. And so it's not just about, reproductive success, but also survival.
Does that suggest that sexual orientation is only rigid because it's socially imposed?
I think
I guess, either or.
I think everything is a combination of biology and culture and history, right? And certainly cultural norms and institutions are a big part of it. But there's just so much variation within and between species that it's hard to say that there's like one particular story here, right? I think variation is just the best way of thinking about it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Could you talk a little bit about, so again, these are very good examples that I didn't come across before, but a lot of the inventions that we have or appreciate in our daily lives maybe come from nature. And I think you've mentioned like CRISPR systems in nature, and I didn't realize that. So a lot of other species got there far before us and showed incredible capacity to actually build things. And some of the examples I'd never heard of.
Biomimicry, this whole field where humans are trying to mimic and model systems off of nature's wisdom. And there are so many great examples. I'm trying to think of my favorites right now. Yeah, I mean, even airplanes, right? It seems sort of like the obvious one, right, because of their shape. But the Wright brothers studied seabirds very carefully, these gannets in North Carolina where they lived, who have these giant, I think 6-foot wingspans. They would go down to the shore and they would watch them intently day after day. And from their observations of these seabirds, developed the models for airplanes. And it's I think, and wind turbines. I think that's one of my favorite ones, that like wind turbine blades are modeled after whale tubercles, these things that allow, like on whales' bodies, that allow them to move through the water seamlessly. The way that they are shaped and positioned on the whales' bodies have inspired the shape and the positioning of wind turbines, and how they can move through the air as seamlessly as whales can move through the water. I mean, there's so many examples, and I think, and CRISPR is another great one.
Obviously, cutting down rainforests is extremely dangerous because of climate change. But again, you make the point that it could be dangerous as well, because we're probably losing treatments for cancers. And obviously, when we lose biodiversity, we're losing more and more medical treatments, which is scary.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to this whole idea of viewing nature through the lens of competition, where it's like we think somehow that if nature loses, we win, right? Like we gain all of this stuff by cutting down forests, when actually, like, nature is not a zero-sum game where you have winners and losers in, this struggle for existence. When Darwin used that term, he also meant it in a metaphorical sense to refer to how beings depend on one another, and how we depend, including how, we might depend on the forests, the living forests, right? Not only for clean air and water, but also, for medicines that are being lost without ever being discovered. Or, so I guess it just comes back to this idea that if we pit nature's needs against our needs, we're missing this bigger story of interdependence. And it could be a win-win, but we're making it a lose-lose.
You really emphasized the idea of, I think you call it the entangled web, where it's kind of pushing back against the concept of like Western individualism, that we're not, like, viewing everything through an individualistic lens might not be the best approach, especially when you consider what we're discovering with the microbiome and its importance. And obviously you have microorganisms living there, and obviously different parts of your body have microbiomes. And again, that was a fantastic point. So we kind of take people as in individual forms, but in fact we're extremely dependent on
and there is some criticism or just rethinking of this metaphor of like a tree of life now, because I'm glad Darwin's coming up a lot in this conversation. I mean, I didn't realize this in writing the book, but like he was right about, I knew he was right about so much, but he came up so much in writing the book that I was like, and I did a lot of research about some of his work that is not as well known, and it was like, gosh, he was right about so much, and his work has really stood the test of time. And he writes about this entangled bank, right, where beings are struggling to coexist and exist together, and it's not just about competition, it's also about cooperation. And that's really how he meant that word, struggle for existence. I think that It's just, it's interesting when you think of these images that we have to describe evolution, right? So we went from like a ladder, a hierarchical view of life, to a tree of life, to Darwin's tree of life, where all beings are connected and have common origins, and then they diversify and they branch out. But there's something about this metaphor of a tree that I think still perpetuates this view of like individuals vying. They're on their own little evolutionary tracks, right? And they're competing against one another, where a lot of scholars now are talking instead about not a ladder or a tree of life, but like a rhizome, where beings are interconnected and struggling together to kind of better encapsulate Darwin's entangled bank idea. Like there's a lot of lateral connections that are happening. We're co-evolving alongside each other. We're not merely getting further and further apart and branching out.
Talk a little bit about Irwin's law.
Sure. Irwin's law, that's a term coined by the ecologist Rob Dunn, who also has a great book out called The Call of the Honey Guide, all about cooperation in nature. I highly recommend it. And he named, so the basic idea of Irwin's law is that life is far more complex than we understand it to be. And it's named after this beetle biologist, Terry Irwin, who with a single study in a rainforest in Panama, like revolutionized our understanding of life on Earth, because we thought that there were, I don't have the numbers top of mind, but like say we thought that there were 10,000 beetle species on Earth, but actually Terry Irwin found that there were likely to be like hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of beetle species on Earth. So like we had this very narrow view of what life looks like. And I think, and Rob Dunn, who coined Irwin's law, he works on microbes and, looks at in households in the US and Canada. We know like less than like such a small fraction, a percentile of a percent, so a fraction of a percent of the species that exist in our homes, the microbes, the fungi, right? And the dimensions of life on Earth are so much more elaborate than we understand them to be. And when we think of life, we tend to think of like humans and primates and other mammals and maybe, but like, yeah, we should be thinking of moths and beetles and, microbes and fungi, because they dominate in a very real way.
People might think the average animal is a mammal, but it obviously
precisely
isn't, which is a fascinating thought. So I don't think you mentioned artificial intelligence in your book, but I'm going to just throw a question at you that I think you might have some insight on. We've spent so much computational resources trying to build these artificial systems that mimic human intelligence or primate intelligence, and people are trying to, like, even after all of this, we're not getting artificial general intelligence or something like powerful intelligence. It's still limited, and it's still quite it's not very robust, and people are trying to work out like what's going on here, what's missing. Do you think like embodiment is a factor, or like the ability to actually experience the real world? Because a lot of people said that might be overrated, but maybe it's not overrated, because it might not necessarily even, like, you might not need a body, but you might need to have some capacity to actually experience the world through senses. Do you think that's a factor there? Or maybe it could be suffering as well, like the capacity to actually suffer, to have maybe genuine threats from that.
I purposely didn't get into this in the book because it's such a big topic. I feel like it's a whole other book, frankly, right? It's such a big topic. And I will note that I find it interesting that we seem to have less of an issue ascribing intelligence and maybe even exploring the potential for consciousness and AI, when it's like we haven't even granted that to so many other forms of life on Earth who've been evolving for millions, if not billions of years, right? And I think there's so much intelligence in evolution. I think that's something that AI lacks, right? It's like we're talking about billions of years, and billions of years in interaction with an environment as an embodied sensory being. And so I think that's more important than, like suffering and sentience, like per se, but just I am on board with the fact that cognition is embodied, right? I mean, we know now, coming back to this point about like what is an individual, our gut microbiomes are responsible for so much of our behavior and even things like depression and anxiety, right? It's not all like the brain, right? We're like whole-bodied organisms. So if we think we can just like somehow upload the contents of the human brain to a machine, we're missing, a big part of the story, which I do think comes back to subjective experience as a fleshy, embodied being in the world.
I think you mentioned Ernest Becker's terror management theory, the idea that like by trying to upload our brain to machines or freezing our bodies or even dismissing the importance of having a body, we're trying to like separate ourselves from other animals, because if we think of ourselves in the same category as other species, like the fear of death is just too prominent. So that was a really interesting way to put it.
There's a lot of interesting links between human exceptionalism and sort of fear of mortality, and therefore the denial of our own animality. And they've done all sorts of studies, like interesting studies where they prime people with thoughts of death, and then they test, whether they're more likely to support notions of human-animal similarity or try to separate them more. And there's absolutely a relationship between, denying death and denying our own animal bodies and natures, right? And it seems very much at the root of this whole like transhumanist movement that we can just we can upload our brains to a machine or preserve our bodies. It's like we're so, and I think it comes back to this notion of individualism. Like if we really believe that we're just individuals and that when we die, that's like the end of us entirely, as opposed to like, no, we become others, or we've taught others and lived and worked with and raised others. And, we're not even fully human. We're composed of all these other beings. Like it's a very, I think, sort of, not understandable, but like I see it as a more reasonable response in like to fear death if we really think we're just individuals and it totally ends with us.
I can't remember you mentioning or discussing religion much in your book in terms of what humans believe, but I would assume there's a correlation between being maybe very religious, definitely in the Christian religion, and maybe underappreciating other species, because you obviously have this idea that God put humans on Earth as, modeled after him kind of thing, and they're superior to other species. So would you think, or would you assume there'd be more pushback from people who are very religious, and obviously who that put humans at the top of the ladder?
Going off of some of the emails that I've been getting, yes.
I thought so. That's interesting. Oh my
from
God,
like
really?
Christian fundamentalists. But I will say, and as I write in the book, I mean, Christianity is not a monolith at all. There's so much variation, within the Christian faith and how it's practiced. And there are, certainly a lot of people in the environmental movement, and when we're talking about human exceptionalism, will point to the Bible and to Genesis in particular, where only humans are made in the image of God and humans are given dominion over Earth and over other species. In fact, you can trace human exceptionalism back way further to like Greek and Hellenistic thought and Aristotle, right? But certainly the dominant interpretation of the Bible has been consistent with an anthropocentric or human exceptionalist ethic. That's not to say, though, that it's exactly what the Bible says, right? There are alternative interpretations of words like dominion, which mean more like stewardship or care, right, for the living world. And I've met a bunch of interesting both scholars in religious studies and practitioners who are absolutely not arrogant apes, but they're devout Christians.
I love the word anthropocentric, but I've avoided saying it for most of this discussion because
it's tricky.
I was afraid I'd mess it up. Do you think that an advanced technological society can actually go on while appreciating and respecting other animals and also stopping ourselves from destroying the planet? Can those two things exist, as in continuing technological advancement and appreciating the planet and biodiversity?
Not in the way it's going at all. I think we would have to radically rethink technology and what it's there for. I'm in the middle of this book called Against the Machine by Paul Kingsnorth, and it's really making me pessimistic about the answer to this question of like whether these things can coexist. I think before reading this book, I was a little bit more like, I think we will have to redeploy technology in a way that can be less anthropocentric, right? That's taking other species' interests seriously. That's facilitating attention to the more than human world, right? Are there ways that we can have technology enhance that attention and that reciprocity? But the way it's so hard for me to imagine what that looks like, because I think the way that technology has been running and operating and probably, the basis on which it was founded is like to control nature, to harness nature, to separate ourselves from it, to put a screen between us and nature. So I don't want to say I'm pessimistic. And it's an open question that I think about a lot. Like, I think it's one of the questions I think about at night before I go to bed. And I don't have a great answer other than, if it's possible, then the technology would need to be radically rethought to take a more ecocentric or species-centric approach.
I guess some people are optimistic that maybe technology could get so good that it doesn't actually cause any more environmental harm. But again, like you said, it's hard to get everyone on board with that. And again, even if some countries can do it, maybe other countries can't.
Yeah, and it's like, what story about Earth and about our relationship to other species is the technology reinforcing? And is it like, we live in this era of amazing innovation, but we can't innovate our way out of a problem that innovation itself caused. Like, I think we really have to be thinking about the underlying cosmology or worldview or ethic or story first, and then maybe we can start thinking about the technologies that we need. A big project that I'm working on right now is about animal birth and pregnancy, these fundamental life history events that other animals, like animals experience, but that we don't really know that much about. So that's a topic I'm very excited about.
That's cool. I think you released a paper this year on sexual selection in females, which was interesting. So is that new territory?
So that paper, I think that was a few years ago, but if it's the one you're referring to, we're basically, they're related ideas insofar as if we try to understand evolution and natural and sexual selection through only a male lens, then females are always, like, males are going to be the reference point, and then females are just going to be versions of what the males don't have, rather than worthy of study in their own right. And I do think that's one of the reasons why pregnancy and birth haven't been given serious scientific consideration, because of the tendency to just overlook these fundamental life history events. It's a fundamental life history event, just like reproduction or growth, survival, development, death, right? And yet we know, compared to those other events, we know hardly anything about it. And I think it's in part because of a tendency to overlook the female perspective in evolution. And there's some great books out there about that oversight.
Yeah. How did you become such a good writer, and how did you put all those ideas together? Because again, it's a really, like, the book is obviously filled with knowledge, but it's really accessible as well. I think almost anyone could read it. You wouldn't have to have a scientific background.
Oh, thanks so much for saying that. It took some time to develop my voice as a non-academic writer, and I always said I would never be a writer. Like, growing up, I hated writing. I would say I will never write, and then I ended up choosing a career where writing was really important, and then I ended up writing a book. Which is ironic, but I think, it took a lot of time and to develop that voice. And during the COVID lockdowns, I had all of these note cards of ideas, things I knew I wanted to include. And I started developing the chapter structure. Like, I'm a very visual, spatial learner. So I started to kind of put together the cards in thematic ways that I thought would work well for a book. Teaching a class also really helps with, like, figuring out the structure and how to anticipate what people might disagree with, and then try to kind of preemptively address those issues, right? So and then I learned in this process to love writing again, and I just enjoyed myself, and I tried to stay in a good relationship with the writing. I did a little bit every day. And I think in my case, I think you can tell when I like it, when I'm enjoying it, because it comes through in the way that it's written. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thanks for joining. And again, the book was fantastic. It was definitely one of the best nonfiction books I've read in a long time.
Thank you so much. Thanks for reaching out for your great questions.